Good afternoon, dear friends. Today, we have for you an incredible story that will capture your imagination and change your faith. Have you ever wondered what you would do if you were thrown into a pot of boiling oil? What if you had remained unharmed? Sounds like an incredible miracle, doesn't it? Today, we will tell you how the Apostle John survived in a cauldron of boiling oil and what significance this event has for us today. This story from the life of one of the closest disciples of Jesus Christ has inspired and amazed believers for centuries. It reminds us of the power of faith and God's protection in the most extreme circumstances. Join us to learn how John's faith and devotion helped him survive the unimaginable and how it can strengthen your faith today. Stay tuned to dive into the amazing story of the Apostle John and discover new aspects of your faith. We are sure that this trip will not leave you indifferent. John, the son of Zebedee and Salome, was born into a fishing family on the shores of Lake Gennesaret. Together with his older brother Jacob, he was immersed in the difficult work of fishing from childhood. Their father, Zebedee, was a respected fisherman, and his sons followed his example, going out to sea daily in their boats to obtain fish for food and sale. It was a simple and difficult life, full of physical challenges and dependence on the vagaries of nature. But even in these harsh conditions, John was open to spiritual quests. At that time, like many other Jews, he was waiting for the coming of the Messiah, the Savior promised in the Scriptures. He likely heard stories and prophecies of future deliverance and dreamed of the day when God would send his chosen one to free their people from oppression and injustice. In his youth, John, despite his busy schedule, could spend his evenings in the synagogue, listening to the readings of the Torah and the teachings of the rabbis. He was inquisitive and sought to understand the deeper meaning of the Scriptures. This was a time when Roman rule oppressed the Jewish people, and every day brought new challenges and trials. One day, while working on the shore of a lake with his brother Jacob and his father, John heard about a new preacher who was attracting many people. This man's name was John the Baptist. He lived in the desert and preached baptism for the forgiveness of sins. They said that he was a voice crying in the wilderness, a harbinger of the coming Messiah. Intrigued, John and James went to listen to this preacher. The words of John the Baptist deeply touched their hearts. He spoke about repentance, about the need to prepare the way for the Lord, and it sounded like a call to action. This may have been their first real contact with a sense of holiness and divine mission. It was then, on the shores of Lake Gennesaret, that their lives changed forever. At some point, while they were busy with their daily activities, Jesus approached them. His words were simple, but filled with power and authority. "Follow me, and I will make you fishers of men." John and James, without hesitation, left their nets and followed him. This moment was the beginning of their new journey. They became one of the first disciples of Jesus Christ, leaving behind their previous lives and completely devoting themselves to serving God. For John, it was a journey of faith that led him through incredible trials and miracles, and ultimately led him to witness one of the greatest miracles in the history of Christianity, salvation from a cauldron of boiling oil. This change in John's life was not just a physical move from fishing nets to following the Master. It was a deep spiritual transition that determined his entire future life. He witnessed and participated in the most important events in the life of Jesus, and his faith grew stronger with each new day spent next to the Son of God. John and his brother James were among the first whom Jesus called to follow him. The day they met Jesus on the shores of Lake Gennesaret, their lives changed forever. But what exactly did this calling mean, and how did it impact their lives and faith? Jesus was known for his ability to see potential in people that others might not see. He came to the shore where John and James were working with their father Zebedee and called to them with amazing simplicity and clarity, "Follow me, and I will make you fishers of men." These words sounded like more than just a call for a change of profession. They promised a new life filled with meaning and divine purpose. John and James left their nets and boat without hesitation. This instant decision demonstrates their willingness to change and their faith in Jesus. They felt that standing before them was not an ordinary person, but one who could really change their destiny. This act of faith and obedience was the first step on a path that would lead them to their greatest spiritual revelations and experiences. John became one of Jesus' closest disciples. He, along with Peter and James, was one of those whom Jesus especially trusted and took with him at the most important moments of his ministry. These three disciples often accompanied Jesus to secluded places for prayer and witnessed key events such as the Transfiguration on Mount Tabor. On the Mount of Transfiguration, John saw Jesus in his divine glory. This event was an important spiritual experience for John and strengthened his faith. He saw Jesus transfigured before him and heard the voice of God proclaiming Jesus to be the Son. This moment was forever etched in John's memory and strengthened his conviction that Jesus was truly the Messiah promised in the Scriptures. John also witnessed many miracles that Jesus performed. He saw Jesus heal the sick, cast out demons, raise the dead, and feed thousands of people with a few loaves and fishes. Each miracle was a manifestation of divine power and love, and each time John became more confident in his faith and mission. Particularly moving was John's presence at the cross during Jesus' crucifixion. He was the only one of the disciples who remained with Jesus to the end. Having crossed himself at Calvary, Jesus entrusted the care of his mother Mary to John, saying, "Woman, behold thy son, and behold thy mother." It was not just an act of trust, but also a sign of deep spiritual kinship and love. After Jesus' resurrection, John was one of the first to discover the empty tomb. He and Peter ran to the burial place and found only burial shrouds there. This event was the culmination of his faith and devotion to Jesus. Knowing that Jesus had conquered death filled his heart with joy and confidence in the truth of the gospel. John's calling was not simply a transition from one profession to another. This was the beginning of a deep spiritual transformation. He became not only a student but also a witness and participant in great divine events. His faith and devotion to Jesus grew stronger every day, and he was ready for any challenge that might come his way. This calling led John to a life of miracles and revelations, and made him one of the pillars of the early Christian church. He went through incredible trials, but his faith remained unshaken. In the future, this will allow him to survive even such extreme tests as immersion in a cauldron of boiling oil, and become a symbol of faith and hope for many generations of Christians. John, as one of Jesus' closest disciples, witnessed many key events that the other disciples did not see. His closeness to Jesus was not accidental. It was a deep spiritual and emotional kinship that developed over time and influenced his entire life. From the very beginning, John stood out among the disciples for his devotion and desire to understand the teachings of Jesus in its deepest essence. He was one of three disciples whom Jesus took with him on special occasions, demonstrating his unique role within the group of disciples. Along with Peter and James, John was present at the resurrection of Jairus' daughter. This experience gave him his first direct evidence of Jesus' power over life and death. However, the most significant event highlighting John's closeness to Jesus was the Transfiguration. On Mount Tabor, Jesus took Peter, James, and John with him and was transfigured before them, showing his divine glory. John saw Jesus' face shine and his clothes become white as light. He also heard the voice of God proclaiming, "This is my beloved Son, in whom I am well pleased. Hear ye him." This experience changed John forever, strengthening his faith and understanding of who Jesus is. John also witnessed some of Jesus' most intimate and personal moments. During the Last Supper, John sat next to Jesus, leaning on his chest. It was a symbol of their closeness and trust. That evening, Jesus spoke to the disciples about the coming suffering, about love and unity, and John was the one who absorbed every word. When Jesus announced that one of his disciples would betray him, John asked, "Lord, who is this?" This moment emphasized the trusting relationship between Jesus and John. During Jesus' arrest in the Garden of Gethsemane, John was one of those who remained with him to the end. He saw Jesus' suffering, his prayers and struggles. At this time, John may not have fully understood the full scale of what was happening, but his devotion and love for the teacher did not allow him to leave him in the most difficult moments. John's role at the cross was especially significant. When the other disciples fled in fear, John remained with Mary, the mother of Jesus, and several women. He was there when Jesus, suffering on the cross, entrusted him with the care of his mother. "Woman, behold your son." Then he said to John, "Here is your mother." From that moment on, John took Mary to him as his mother. This was not just an act of human concern, but also a spiritual commission, which John took with deep gratitude and seriousness. After Jesus' resurrection, John was one of the first to see the empty tomb. Together with Peter, he ran to the tomb and saw that the body of Jesus had disappeared. This event was the culmination of their faith, a confirmation of all the prophecies and words they had heard from Jesus. John saw and believed that Jesus had risen as he had promised. John's closeness to Jesus was not limited to just physical presence. It was a deep spiritual connection that developed every day. John perceived Jesus not only as a teacher, but also as a friend, mentor, and Son of God. His letters and the gospel written later reflect this closeness and deep understanding of the divine nature of Jesus. John lived a long life as a true witness to the love and teachings of Jesus. His unique role among the disciples and close relationship with Jesus made him one of the most significant figures of the early Christian church. This closeness gave him the strength and faith to survive all trials, including a miraculous rescue from a cauldron of boiling oil, and become a living testimony of divine protection and love. After the ascension of Jesus Christ, the life of the Apostle John took a new direction. Although he remained one of the apostles, his mission and responsibilities changed significantly. John, along with the other apostles, was called to spread the gospel throughout the world, following the Great Commission given to them by Jesus. Go into all the world and preach the gospel to every creature. At first, John remained in Jerusalem, where, together with Peter and James, he led the early Christian community. This was a time of great growth and testing for the church. On the day of Pentecost, when the Holy Spirit descended on the apostles, John became a witness and participant in the birth of the church. He, like the other apostles, began to speak in different languages, which allowed them to preach the gospel to people from different nations gathered in Jerusalem. John actively participated in preaching and disseminating the teachings of Christ. He and Peter often went together preaching and performing miracles. One of these events was the healing of a lame man at the Red Gate of the temple. When Peter said to the lame man, "In the name of Jesus Christ of Nazareth, arise and walk," John was there, confirming the miracle with his faith and presence. This miracle attracted a lot of attention and gave the apostles the opportunity to preach to many people. However, the growth and spread of Christianity did not go unnoticed by the authorities. John, like the other apostles, faced persecution and arrest. At some point, he was imprisoned along with Peter, but even the prison walls could not stop their mission. One night, an angel of the Lord opened the prison doors and led them outside, allowing them to continue preaching. After his release from prison, John continued his missionary work. According to tradition, he preached in various cities and regions, including Ephesus, where he spent a significant part of his life. Ephesus was a large city and an important center of early Christianity. Here, John founded a community and continued to preach despite all the difficulties and dangers. One of John's key roles was to care for Mary, the mother of Jesus. After Jesus entrusted him with this responsibility at the cross, John took Mary in and cared for her for the rest of her life. This was not just the fulfillment of an order, but also an expression of deep respect and love for the Mother of the Lord. In his mission, John not only preached, but also wrote letters to Christian communities, which were included in the New Testament as the first, second, and third epistles of John. In these letters, he addressed the believers with instructions and encouragement, emphasizing the importance of love, truth, and unity in the Christian life. His words, "God is love," and "Whoever abides in love abides in God, and God in him," became the central themes of his teaching. However, John's most significant trials lay ahead. During the reign of Emperor Domitian, severe persecution of Christians began. John, as one of the leaders of the church, was arrested and sent to trial. According to legend, he was sentenced to death by immersion in a cauldron of boiling oil. But a miracle happened. John remained unharmed. This miraculous rescue was a powerful testimony of divine protection and strengthened the faith of many Christians. After this miracle, John was exiled to the island of Patmos, where he was given a great revelation. On this secluded island, he received a vision which he recorded in the book of Revelation, the last book of the New Testament. In these visions, John saw the end of times, the second coming of Christ, and the eternal kingdom of God. His revelations became an important source of comfort and hope for believers going through trials and persecution. John lived a long life as a true testimony of the love and power of God. He saw both the growth and trials of the church, and his faith remained steadfast to the end. His life and works left a deep mark on the history of Christianity, and his example continues to inspire believers around the world. John, after the ascension of Jesus, became not only the leader of the church, but also a living testimony of divine power and love. His life was filled with miracles, trials, and revelations that strengthened the faith of many generations of Christians. This great apostle left us a legacy of faith, hope, and love that continues to inspire today. During the reign of Emperor Domitian, Christianity spread more and more, causing concern among the Roman authorities. The growing popularity of the new religion, its influence, and the preaching of John as one of the key leaders of the Christian community became a target for repression. Domitian, known for his cruelty and intolerance of any threats to his rule, decided to suppress the influence of Christianity and put an end to its leaders. John, known for his preaching and miracles performed in the name of Jesus, was arrested. This was a difficult period for all believers, as many Christians were persecuted, arrested, and executed for their faith. John was brought to Rome, where a trial and, as expected, a harsh sentence awaited him. Before the trial, John behaved with dignity and calm, demonstrating his unshakable faith in God. He knew that his mission was not over and that his life was in the hands of the Lord. The trial was brief and biased. John was accused of sedition, promoting a new religion, and refusing to worship the Roman gods. He was sentenced to death by immersion in a cauldron of boiling oil, which should have become a terrifying example for all Christians. The day of execution arrived, and John was led to a huge cauldron in which oil was boiling. A crowd gathered to witness this brutal execution, expecting a painful death for the condemned man. But John, despite the terrible reality of what was happening, remained calm and collected. He prayed, relying on the will of God, knowing that his life was in the hands of the Almighty. When John was lowered into the cauldron, something incredible happened. Instead of being burned in the boiling oil, John remained unharmed. This miracle stunned everyone present. People were shocked and couldn't believe their eyes. Oil, which was supposed to be an instrument of torture and death, became evidence of divine intervention and protection. John emerged from the cauldron unharmed, causing awe and admiration among those who witnessed the event. Emperor Domitian, having learned about what had happened, was furious and at the same time confused. His plan to intimidate Christians failed. He understood that the execution of John not only did not stop the spread of Christianity, but also became another powerful evidence of divine power, confirming the truth of John's preaching. Not wanting to allow John to further strengthen his influence, Domitian decided to exile him to the island of Patmos. This was a remote and sparsely populated island in the Aegean Sea, where it was assumed that John would not be able to continue his missionary work and his influence on the Christian community would be minimal. But even this exile became part of the divine plan, opening new horizons of spiritual experience to John. The journey to Patmos was not easy. John abandoned his friends and associates, leaving behind the communities he had supported and inspired for so long. But his spirit remained unshaken. He saw his exile not as a punishment, but as a new opportunity to serve God. On Patmos, John found solitude that allowed him to delve deeper into prayer and reflection. On this island, he was given a great revelation, which he recorded in the book of Revelation. This book was the last book of the New Testament, containing prophecies about the end of times, the second coming of Christ, and the establishment of God's eternal kingdom. The visions that were given to John became a source of consolation and hope for Christians who were experiencing persecution and trials. John saw in his visions the future that God revealed to him. He wrote about a new heaven and a new earth, about the city of God, where there is no pain, no suffering, no death. He saw Jesus, the Lamb of God, defeat evil and establish an everlasting kingdom of justice and peace. These revelations became an important source of inspiration and strengthening of faith for all Christians going through difficult times. Thus, the attempted execution of John was not only a testament to his faith, but also a powerful testimony to divine power and protection. His exile on Patmos opened the door to new spiritual revelations that continue to inspire and strengthen believers to this day. John's story shows that even in the most difficult trials, God remains close, protecting and guiding those who are faithful to him. The story of John's miraculous rescue from a cauldron of boiling oil continues to be one of the most amazing and inspiring in the Christian tradition. This incident not only shocked his contemporaries, but also became a powerful testimony of faith and divine intervention for future generations. When John was thrown into boiling oil, everyone expected to see a terrible death. However, instead of suffering and dying, John emerged from the cauldron completely unharmed. This miracle was a clear demonstration of God's power and protection. The people who had gathered to witness the execution were stunned and could not believe their eyes. This was not just salvation, but a clear and public confirmation that God protects his faithful servants. Rumors of John's miraculous salvation quickly spread throughout Rome and beyond. This incident became a powerful testimony for many people who began to think about who Jesus Christ really was and what the significance of his preaching was. People began to see in John not just a teacher, but a man on whom God's grace clearly rested. For Christians themselves, this miracle became a source of great inspiration and strengthening of faith. In the face of severe persecution, they received clear evidence that God does not abandon his children and is able to protect them even in the most extreme circumstances. This event reminded them of the many miracles that Jesus performed during his earthly life and confirmed that the power of God had not weakened. John himself, having gone through this test, was even more strengthened in his faith and devotion to God. He understood that his life was under God's protection and that he must continue his mission despite all obstacles. The miracle of salvation was a confirmation to him that his work was not yet finished and that God had important plans for him. This event also became a challenge for the Roman authorities. They could not ignore the fact of the miraculous salvation and its influence on public opinion. The attempt to intimidate Christians and suppress their faith turned against them. John's miracle of salvation only strengthened the believer's conviction that God is always there and that He is able to protect them from any danger. For John, this miracle became not just personal salvation, but also a powerful preaching tool. He used this experience to testify of God's power and love, calling people to faith and trust in God. His sermons after this incident became even more inspiring and powerful, as he could talk not only about the miracles of Jesus, but also about what God had done for him personally. John's miracle of salvation also became an important element of early Christian tradition and teaching. It confirmed the truth of Jesus' words that faith, even the size of a mustard seed, can do great things. John's story became a living example of how faith and devotion to God can overcome any obstacle. Subsequently, John continued his missionary work, bringing the message of Christ to different regions. His testimony of miracles and salvation inspired and strengthened Christian communities, helping them overcome difficulties and maintain faith. He became a symbol of courage and steadfastness in faith, showing by his example that even in the most difficult circumstances, God remains faithful to His promises. The miracle of John's salvation from a cauldron of boiling oil will forever remain in the history of Christianity as one of the most striking manifestations of God's power and mercy. It reminds all believers that God is always near and that no trials can break those who trust in Him. This story continues to inspire and strengthen the faith of people around the world, showing that miracles are still possible today. After the miraculous rescue of John from a cauldron of boiling oil, the Roman authorities found themselves in a difficult situation. The execution, which was supposed to serve as a deterrent to Christians, turned into a testament to divine protection and power. Emperor Domitian, realizing that conventional methods did not work on such a faithful follower of Christ, decided on a longer and more debilitating punishment: the exile of John to the island of Patmos. Patmos, a small and rocky island in the Aegean Sea, was known as a place of exile for political and religious prisoners. The island was located far from the main trade routes, and life on it was hard and harsh. John, now an elderly man, found himself in conditions where there were no usual comforts and support. However, even in these difficult circumstances, his faith and devotion to God remained unshakable. The journey to Patmos was not an easy ordeal in itself. John left his community, friends, and associates, not knowing whether he would see them again. But he was ready to accept any challenge, seeing this as an opportunity for spiritual growth and new service to God. On Patmos, John found solitude that allowed him to delve deeper into prayer and reflection. It was on this island that John was given a great revelation, which he wrote down in the book of Revelation. One of the key aspects of John's time on Patmos was his closeness to God through prayer and meditation. In solitude and silence, he was able to hear the voice of the Lord, who revealed to him visions about the future of the world. In his revelation, John saw events that would take place at the end of time. He described visions of a great battle between good and evil, the second coming of Christ, and the creation of a new heaven and a new earth. These visions were filled with symbolism and deep spiritual wisdom that required readers to think deeply and spiritually. One of the most important aspects of John's revelation was his letter to the 7 churches of Asia. In these letters, John conveyed the words of Jesus to specific Christian communities, highlighting their strengths and weaknesses, as well as giving instructions and warnings. These messages became an important source of spiritual guidance for churches and remain relevant today. On Patmos, John had a profound spiritual experience that transformed him and deepened his understanding of God's plan. Despite the difficulties and isolation, he remained faithful to his calling, Continuing to serve God through his visions and writings, his revelations became a powerful testimony of faith and an inspiration to all believers. Life on Patmos was not easy. John probably lived in a simple hut or cave, facing harsh conditions on a daily basis. He did not have access to the usual comforts and support, but his faith and devotion to God gave him the strength to overcome all difficulties. Every day he prayed and meditated, receiving new revelations and instructions from God. When John wrote his revelations, he did not know how they would be received or what impact they would have on the Christian community. But he believed that this message was given to him by God for the strengthening and instruction of believers. His visions of the end of times, the struggle between good and evil, the victory of Christ and the establishment of God's eternal kingdom became a source of consolation and hope for all Christians. The time spent on Patmos became a period of deep spiritual growth and revelation for John. He was able to hear the voice of God in silence and solitude, and his revelations became an important source of spiritual wisdom for all believers. The exile, which should have broken his spirit, became a time of great spiritual renewal and strengthening of faith. Thus, exile to Patmos was not a punishment for John, but a blessing. He was able to experience profound spiritual revelations and record them for future generations. His life and work on this island were a testament to his unwavering faith and devotion to God, showing that even in the most difficult circumstances, strength and inspiration can be found in God's grace. John's miraculous rescue from a cauldron of boiling oil and his subsequent exile to Patmos had a huge impact on believers, both in his time and in subsequent centuries. These events not only strengthened the faith of the early Christians, but also inspired them to new exploits and service to God, despite all the difficulties and dangers. John's story became a symbol of unshakable faith and divine protection. For many believers, it served as confirmation that God is always there and ready to protect his faithful servants. In the face of severe persecution, Christians found comfort and hope in the example of John. His rescue from a cauldron of boiling oil was a clear demonstration that God's power can overcome all human plans. This story was passed down orally, becoming part of the oral tradition of the early church. She encouraged Christians not to fear martyrdom or persecution, reminding them that even in the most extreme circumstances, God could intervene and perform a miracle. Faith in divine protection and John's power gave believers confidence that their suffering was not in vain and that God was always with them. John's letters and revelations on Patmos also had a profound impact on Christian communities. His letters to the 7 churches of Asia contained important instruction and encouragement that helped many believers strengthen their faith. In these letters, John emphasized the importance of love, truth, and faithfulness to God, reminding Christians to remain steadfast in their faith. The book of Revelation, written by John, has become an essential source of spiritual inspiration and instruction for all Christians. Her visions of the end of times, the second coming of Christ, and the establishment of God's kingdom gave believers hope for the future and confidence in the victory of good over evil. These prophecies reminded Christians that their suffering was temporary and that at the end of time, God would bring justice and peace. Particularly important was John's influence on the communities that he personally founded and supported. In Ephesus and other cities where John preached and ministered, his example and instruction became a source of strength and inspiration for local Christians. He was not only a spiritual leader but also a living witness of God's power and mercy. His life and works showed believers that even in the most difficult conditions, one can remain faithful to God and serve Him with devotion and love. John's story also influenced the development of Christian theology and spirituality. His teachings on love and truth, as well as his visions of the end times, became important aspects of Christian doctrine. His writings helped shape ideas about how believers should live and serve God in anticipation of the second coming of Christ. John's influence was felt not only in his time, but also in subsequent centuries. His example continued to inspire Christian martyrs, saints, and theologians. His writings and teachings have become part of the Christian canon and continue to be studied and used in worship and preaching. John's story reminded believers of all times that God is always there and that faith in Him can overcome any trial. Thus, John's influence on believers was enormous and multifaceted. His life and works inspired and strengthened Christian communities, helping them overcome difficulties and maintain faith. His miraculous salvation and revelations were a powerful testimony of God's power and mercy that continues to inspire believers around the world. John's story shows that even in the most difficult circumstances, strength and comfort can be found in God, and that faith in Him can overcome any obstacle. The story of the Apostle John, his miraculous salvation and profound spiritual revelations, had a profound impact on Christian communities not only in ancient times, but also in subsequent centuries. His life and work inspired many believers, and his testimony continued to spread, strengthening and encouraging those in difficult circumstances. Many believers, inspired by John's example, drew strength from his story and revelations. One such example is the Christians who lived under conditions of severe persecution in the Roman Empire. In the 1st and 2nd centuries, when Christianity was under severe repression, many believers found comfort and support in the stories of miracles and divine protection that accompanied the Apostle John. Testimonies of John's faith were passed down orally, becoming part of the oral tradition and strengthening communities. These stories inspired Christians to maintain faith and perseverance despite the threat of imprisonment, torture, and death. Believers saw John's story as proof that God does not abandon His children, even in the most difficult circumstances. In the Middle Ages, when Christianity became the dominant religion in Europe, the examples of the lives of the apostles, including John, played an important role in the formation of Christian culture and spirituality. Monks and priests studied the works of John, his letters and revelation, drawing from them wisdom and inspiration for their spiritual life and ministry. One such example is the testimony of St. John Chrysostom, the great theologian and preacher. He often referred to the writings of the Apostle John in his sermons, emphasizing the importance of love, truth, and devotion to God. John Chrysostom found in the life and works of the Apostle John a source of spiritual inspiration and instruction for his parishioners. In modern times, as Christianity began to spread throughout the world, the story of John and his revelations continued to influence believers. Missionaries who went to remote parts of the world took with them the gospel and stories of miracles that God performed through His apostles. They used John's story to strengthen the faith of new converts and show them that God's power and mercy continue to work today. One striking example of this influence is the testimony of Christian missionaries in Africa and Asia. They told new converts about John's miracles and his unwavering faith to inspire them to embrace Christianity and strengthen their faith in God. These stories helped new converts see that their faith had deep roots and that God was able to work miracles in every person's life. In today's world, as Christianity continues to face new challenges and trials, the testimony of John's life remains relevant and inspiring. In times of political and social change, Christians find comfort and encouragement in the examples of faith and devotion of the Apostle John. John's story also resonates in the personal testimonies of believers. Many people facing difficulties and trials draw strength from his example. They see in his life proof that God is always there, that faith can overcome any obstacle, and that even in the most difficult circumstances one can find comfort and hope in God. For example, Testimonies of contemporary Christians who have experienced serious illness, bereavement, or other trials in life often include references to the inspiration they received from John's story. They talk about how reading his revelations and reflecting on his life helped them strengthen their faith and find strength to overcome difficulties. Thus, the testimonies of believers inspired by the life and works of the Apostle John continue to play an important role in the strengthening and development of the Christian faith. John's story, miraculous salvation, and spiritual revelations remain a powerful source of inspiration and encouragement for all who seek deep and abiding faith in God. The story of the Apostle John and his miraculous salvation from a cauldron of boiling oil is important for believers not only in the past, but also today. It reminds us of the key aspects of the Christian faith and inspires us to live a life of faith and devotion to God. The first thing John's story emphasizes is the unshakable strength of faith. Despite all the trials and dangers, John remained faithful to God. His life shows us that faith is not just words or beliefs, but a deep and abiding trust in God that persists even in the most difficult circumstances. John's faith, which allowed him to survive in a cauldron of boiling oil, is an example for every believer, demonstrating that with God's help, any difficulties can be overcome. The second important aspect is divine protection and mercy. John's miraculous salvation testifies that God does not leave his children in trouble. Even in the most extreme situations, when there seems to be no way out, God can intervene and perform a miracle. This reminds us to trust God and rely on His protection and mercy. Faith in God's power and protection can give us courage and calm in any situation. The third aspect is the importance of spiritual revelation and guidance. On the island of Patmos, John received revelations that became an important source of spiritual instruction for all Christians. These revelations recorded in the book of Revelation show us that God continues to speak to us and guide us through His Word. They remind us of the importance of reading and studying the Bible, seeking God's guidance in our lives, and following His instructions. The fourth aspect is the importance of love and unity in the Christian life. In his letters, John often emphasized the importance of loving God and neighbor. He taught that God is love and that true faith is demonstrated through loving and caring for others. This is especially true today when the world faces many conflicts and disagreements. John's example reminds us to strive for unity and love in our relationships with others. The fifth aspect is hope for the future and confidence in God's plan. John's revelations about the end times and the second coming of Christ give us hope for the future and confidence that God's plan will be fulfilled. Faith in God's plan and promises helps us maintain hope and courage even when we face difficulties and trials. It reminds us that our suffering is temporary and that God will ultimately bring about justice and peace. In modern life, as we face uncertainty, fear, and difficulty, John's story continues to inspire and strengthen our faith. It reminds us of the power and importance of faith, of God's protection and mercy, of the need for spiritual revelation and guidance, of the meaning of love and unity, and of hope for the future. Many Christians today find comfort and encouragement in John's example. They read his revelations and letters, drawing from them inspiration and guidance for their spiritual lives. In difficult times, they remember John's miraculous salvation and his unshakable faith, finding in this example strength to overcome their own trials. John's story also inspires us to serve God and others. It shows that each of us can be an instrument of God's will and love if we trust Him and follow His calling. No matter what challenges we face, God can use us to accomplish His plan and spread His love and truth to the world. Thus, the significance of John's story for our faith today is enormous. It inspires us to deep and abiding faith, reminds us of God's protection and mercy, emphasizes the importance of spiritual revelation and guidance, teaches love and unity, and gives hope for the future. John's faith, miraculous salvation, and spiritual revelations continue to inspire and strengthen believers around the world, helping us to remain faithful to God and serve Him in all circumstances. The story of the Apostle John, his miraculous salvation and revelations on the island of Patmos, is a powerful testimony to the faith, power, and love of God. We conclude by taking stock and looking at how these events continue to impact our lives and faith today. John's example teaches us that faith can withstand any test. Despite all the difficulties, John remained faithful to God and his mission. His story reminds us that faith is not just a belief, but a deep trust in God that remains in all circumstances. John's faith inspires us to persevere and be courageous even when we face life's challenges. John's miraculous rescue from a cauldron of boiling oil demonstrates that God is always there and ready to protect His faithful servants. This event reminds us of God's power and mercy, emphasizing that no situation is hopeless if we trust in God. It inspires us not to lose hope and to continue to rely on God's protection and help in difficult moments in our lives. The revelations John received on Patmos show us the importance of spiritual revelation and guidance. These visions of the end times and the second coming of Christ give us hope for the future and confidence in God's plan. They remind us that God continues to speak to us through His Word and that we should seek His guidance in our lives. John's revelations also emphasize the importance of being ready for Christ's return and living according to His teachings. John's letters to the 7 churches of Asia remind us of the importance of love and unity in the Christian life. He emphasizes that love for God and neighbor is the basis of our faith. These messages teach us to care for each other, support each other, and strive for unity in our communities. They also encourage us to be faithful and steadfast in our faith despite trials and difficulties. John's story also emphasizes the importance of hope for the future. His visions of a new heaven and a new earth of God's kingdom where there is no pain and suffering give us confidence that our suffering is temporary and that at the end of time, God will bring justice and peace. This hope helps us overcome difficulties and maintain faith in God's plan and His promises. John's faith, miraculous salvation, and revelations continue to inspire believers around the world. They remind us that God is always there, that faith can overcome any trial, and that love and unity are key aspects of the Christian life. John's story shows us that even in the most difficult circumstances, we can find strength and comfort in God. Today, as we face challenges and uncertainty, John's story reminds us of the importance of trusting and being faithful to God. It inspires us to serve God and others, to live a deep spiritual life, and to have hope for the future. May John's example strengthen our faith and help us live according to God's calling. The story of the Apostle John is one of courage, faith, and divine intervention that continues to inspire and strengthen believers around the world. His life and works remind us that with God all things are possible and that faith in Him can overcome any obstacle. May this story be an inspiration and a reminder of God's love and power in our lives. Thank you for being with us today. Let John's example strengthen your faith and inspire you to live a life of love and devotion to God. Until next time, and God bless you.